The hangar lights buzzed overhead, cold, fluorescent, and unforgiving. Rows of engineers stood around the prototype drone, their eyes flicking between monitors and tablets. The test run had failed. Again. For the fourth time that week, the aircraft had refused to lift more than 2 feet off the ground before stalling mid-arc and crashing nose first into the test mat. "It's not the code," someone muttered. "It has to be the code," another shot back. The startup sequence is misreading wind directionals. It's blind during initialization. Maybe the hardware's junk. No one noticed the old man sitting quietly in the far corner of the hangar. He was slouched on a plastic chair, worn jacket zipped up to his chin, a thermos untouched by his feet. His hands were folded in his lap, eyes half closed. He hadn't spoken all morning. He never did. To most of them, he was just the retired maintenance guy. The guy who still showed up even after his contract ended. The one who swept the far hangar after hours like it mattered. One intern looked over and chuckled. "Why's he always here anyway? You think he even knows what we're building?" A programmer nearby smirked. "Doubt he even knows what a startup sequence is." But 3 hours later, after the last test failed, and the lead engineer was ready to scrap the entire boot logic, that same old man stood up, walked across the hangar, and picked up a dry erase marker. He didn't say a word. He just wrote a single line of code on the whiteboard and changed everything. His name was Huy Linh, though few ever asked. To most of the staff at the airfield's testing center, he was just the old guy who walked the perimeter fence in the morning and sat quietly by the hangar door during flight trials. He wore the same navy windbreaker every day, patched at the elbow, and carried a thermos that always smelled faintly of cinnamon tea. Nobody knew that he used to fly, not as a pilot, but as the man who taught planes how to talk to the wind. Back in the late 1970s, Huy Linh had worked on one of the first analog flight stabilization systems for short-range reconnaissance aircraft. His specialty wasn't hardware or navigation, it was timing. He believed that startup logic wasn't about brute force or endless redundancy. It was about reading the moment when air first met wing. That sliver of time when direction, drag, temperature, and thrust had to agree or the plane wouldn't fly. He didn't go to MIT, didn't wear a badge, but he listened to machines, to air currents, to the silence between failures. His breakthrough was a startup patch, nicknamed Wind-Blind Correction. A single line of logic that taught drones to pause for a fraction of a second and feel the invisible pull before launching. For 10 years, the system ran silently across dozens of test aircraft. No one questioned it. Then came the layoffs, the reorgs, the new hires with degrees in quantum control theory. Huy's name vanished from the documentation when the systems migrated to digital flight platforms. The new engineers didn't see value in a pause. They wanted acceleration, speed, efficiency. Huy Linh didn't protest. He packed his desk, left his badge on the table, and walked away. But somehow, he never really left. When Clara was hired as an intern, she was the only one who talked to him. She asked him what his job had been before maintenance. He didn't answer. But the next day, she found a folded napkin on her workstation. It had a line of pseudocode on it, written in blocky, deliberate handwriting. Just a single line: if wind, diff 0.03, then wait until drift SAR stable. She kept it, taped it above her monitor, even though she didn't understand it yet. Later that week, she asked him where he learned it. He just smiled and replied, "From the air." Most of the others forgot he was even there. Until that afternoon, when startup logic failed one final time and their aircraft wouldn't fly. Until their data models crashed and the drone blinked like it was blind to the sky. Until Huy Linh stood up from his chair, walked silently across the room, and picked up the marker. He hadn't touched code in over 2 decades, but the wind hadn't changed. The room went still when Huy Linh reached the whiteboard. No one told him to stop, but no one invited him either. The engineers stood frozen behind their monitors, unsure whether to laugh, step in, or just Watch. The youngest one, Clara, held her breath. The marker in his hand squeaked slightly as he uncapped it, and then he wrote, just one line. Deliberate. Simple. No annotations. No function calls. No explanations. If drift, 0.03, wait for stability. He stepped back, capped the marker, and placed it neatly on the board rail, then turned hands behind his back like a soldier returning to formation. Nobody moved. Finally, someone chuckled from the corner. You're kidding, right? That's it. Drift delay logic, another muttered. We scrapped that in phase 1. The lead systems engineer, Maya, folded her arms. We've tried over 2,000 variations. None of them solved the startup instability. What makes you think this one will? Huy looked at her, didn't blink, didn't waver. Because you're teaching it to push through the wind, he said softly. You should be teaching it to wait for the wind to agree. The room fell quiet again. Clara stepped forward. Let me try it, she said. Maya raised an eyebrow. You want to risk another burnout on this guy's napkin code logic. Clara glanced at the drone, then at the old man, then back at Maya. If it fails, we're no worse off. But if it works... Her voice dropped. Then he's not a janitor. He's the one who's been right this entire time. Silence. Maya exhaled. Run it in the sim first. Clara didn't wait. She moved fast, her fingers flying over the keyboard, implementing the logic just as he'd written it. No additions, no safeguards. She clicked start. The simulation booted. The engine cycled up, and for the first time in 4 days, the drift error didn't spike. Startup held. Perfectly. They all looked at the whiteboard again. Then at him. And for the first time, someone asked, Sir, what else do you remember? The screen didn't glitch. The numbers didn't spike. For the first time in 4 days, the simulation ran smooth, steady, clean. Maya leaned forward, eyes scanning the data in disbelief. No vibration warning, no tilt deviation, no drift error. The drone's virtual startup had stabilized and stayed stable. Clara turned slowly toward the others. It held, she whispered. Someone in the back stood up. Wait. It held. No one answered. They didn't need to. Huy Linh was still standing near the board. He hadn't moved, didn't gloat, didn't smile. Just nodded once, barely noticeable, like a man who had already lived through this moment in 1,000 daydreams and knew exactly how it would feel, quiet, still, and sharp as breath on a winter morning. Maya stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. That's not even a full line, she muttered, not looking at him. There's no buffer check, no conditional return. It just waits. It just pauses. Clara nodded. And maybe that's what we've been missing. Maya looked at her. We've spent months engineering complex failovers, chasing nanosecond optimization, and all this time what we needed was a pause. Clara looked at Huy. Not a pause, she said. A moment of agreement. The team reset the test rig for a live trial. This time, all eyes were on the actual drone. Not the whiteboard, not the models, but the real machine resting silently at the edge of the hangar. Clara walked over to Huy and offered him the launch tablet. He shook his head gently. You fly it, he said. I just wrote it. She nodded, hands shaking just slightly as she tapped the sequence. Engines spun. Wings adjusted. Stabilizers fluttered to life. Then air. Clean. Lift. The drone rose slowly, almost reverently, then hovered with a grace none of them had seen before. Applause didn't break out. Not yet. It was too soon. They were still absorbing. One of the junior engineers turned toward the whiteboard again. Where did you learn that? He asked Huy. The old man looked toward the ceiling. Flew with the wind, he said. Long before any of you taught computers to ignore it. That night, Clara stayed behind. She found Huy folding up a chair in the back of the hangar alone again. You knew, she said. He paused. Knew what? That the machine didn't need more logic. It needed permission to listen. Huy smiled softly. No one wants to wait anymore, he said. But sometimes if you give silence a fraction of a second, it gives you everything. 3 days later, the knock came at 8:04 a.m. Not rushed, not timid, just firm. Huy Linh was already awake, sipping warm tea on his tiny apartment balcony, the same way he started every morning, slowly, without noise. He heard the knock and knew somehow that the silence he had lived in for years was finally breaking. He opened the door to find Maya and Clara standing in the hall. Maya looked different, not just tired but thoughtful. She held a sealed envelope with the test results printed on official company letterhead. Clara stood beside her holding a laptop. "We ran your logic against all archived startup protocols," Maya said. "Simulated it across 4 drone platforms, 2 fixed-wing aircraft, and 1 rotary model." Huy just looked at her. "It held," she added quietly. "Every time." Clara opened the laptop and turned the screen toward him. The top of the document read, "Request for Systems Consultancy. Senior Engineer Legacy Architecture Temporary Assignment. Autonomous Flight Optimization Team." At the bottom was a signature line. His name had already been typed in. Huy didn't speak. "We want you to come back," Maya said. "Not as a guest. Not as a memory. As a mentor. As part of the team." He stared at the document. It had been decades since anyone had invited him to anything with his name already printed. That night, he sat at his kitchen table for hours. The contract lay untouched beside an old cloth notebook. The same one he'd used years ago to sketch logic gates when systems were still analog, when he had more questions than answers, and somehow that had made him necessary. Now he wasn't sure. Clara called around 10 p.m. "You didn't sign it?" she said softly. He stayed quiet. "Are you afraid you won't remember how to do it?" she asked. He finally spoke. "No. I'm afraid they'll remember just long enough to forget me again." Clara paused, then said with the kind of certainty that only comes from faith, "Then let's make them remember through the code, not through the noise. They don't have to remember your name. Just the moment you helped the wind listen again." The next morning, he brought the contract back. No fanfare, no announcement. He left it on Maya's desk, with a small note clipped to the top. "If the wind still flies straight, I'll stay." By noon, he was back in the lab, and this time, no one mistook him for a janitor. They pulled up a chair, opened the system logs, and said, "Let's begin where the drift ends." They called it a review session, but the room looked more like a tribunal. Long table, folded arms, suits and screens and sterile smiles. 3 senior executives from the funding board sat opposite the engineering team. Clara was near the back, laptop open but untouched. Maya sat beside Huy Linh, her fingers laced tightly on the table like she was bracing for turbulence. The drone test had been a success. Twice. But now they wanted documentation, patent records, academic backing. They wanted proof that this man, this quiet, uncredentialed figure, was more than a fluke with good instincts. The first executive, a man with a silver tie and colder eyes, adjusted his glasses. "So, you're telling us that a previously unvetted individual walked into your lab and wrote one undocumented line of code that now underpins your most stable test data?" Maya cleared her throat. "We verified the results across platforms. The logic he introduced corrects for startup phase wind drift with near zero latency overhead." The second executive leaned forward. "But there's no paper trail. No prior publication, no affiliation, no technical review. How can we justify allocating further resources based on undocumented tribal knowledge?" Huy Linh didn't speak. He just looked at the corner of the table where someone had chipped the laminate and never fixed it. It bothered him more than the questions. The third executive, a woman with impeccable posture and a disarming smile, spoke next. "Mr. Linh," she said gently, "we don't doubt your contribution, but we live in a regulated ecosystem. If something goes wrong down the line and your logic hasn't been peer-reviewed, we could be liable. Legally, financially, ethically." Huy raised his head. "I didn't write it to be defended," he said quietly. I wrote it to fly. Silence. The man with the silver tie exhaled sharply. We're suspending the test phase until further review. Effective immediately. Clara stood. You're grounding the program because he doesn't have a LinkedIn page. The room didn't answer, because it already had. Back in the hangar, Huy packed his thermos slowly. No one said anything. The whiteboard had already been wiped. His line was gone. Erased clean, like it had never existed. Maya walked over furious. This is ridiculous. The code works. The data proves it. He looked at her gently. It always starts like this. What? The moment they can't explain it, they erase it. He took a folded napkin from his coat pocket. The same one he'd once handed Clara years ago. He handed it back to her. This time, don't tape it to a wall. Build with it. She held it like it was glass. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, quietly, like always. That night, Clara sat alone in the lab, staring at the simulation screen. She input his line again manually, ran the model, watched the aircraft stabilize on the screen like it was exhaling, still holding, still flying, still his, and she whispered to herself, they can erase boards, but not wind. Clara didn't sleep that night. After the review board shut the project down, the lab emptied out like a punctured tire. Monitors went dark. Coffee cups were left half full. Even Maya left in silence, her jaw tight and her eyes unreadable. But Clara stayed. She couldn't walk away, not this time. On her desk sat the napkin creased, yellowing delicate. The line of logic was still there, written in steady, blocky letters. She didn't tape it to the wall. She coded it, line by line, and then she did something the board never saw coming. She sent the module to 6 open-source aeronautics forums. Anonymous upload. No branding, no names. Just raw code and a brief note. Try this in your startup logic. Drift error, 0.03 will stabilize in less than 300 mils. No machine learning required. She hit post and waited. Nothing happened the first hour or the second. But by dawn, a quiet buzz had begun to ripple through the forums. Day 2. An independent drone hobbyist in Arizona reported that his DIY glider was flying more steadily than ever before. He said the new logic felt like the plane had grown eyes. Day 3. A flight engineer in Finland ran it through a cold weather model. Startup drift dropped to 0, he wrote. I've never seen that without deep loop correction. Who wrote this? Day 4. A retired air traffic specialist shared the logic with his nephew at a university lab. The professor contacted Clara directly asking, did your team really build this? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she forwarded him a photograph. It was old, faded, taken decades ago in black and white. A younger version of Huy Linh stood beside an early drone prototype, hands resting lightly on the stabilizer wing. No smile, just focus. Clara wrote beneath it, he didn't build it, he taught it how to wait. By the end of the week, something extraordinary had happened. The logic, Huy's logic, was being studied in research labs from Tokyo to Montreal. Engineers were trying to understand why such a simple line performed so efficiently. Some called it drift delay with intuition. Others began calling it by another name. The Linh pause. It spread because it worked. No resume, no credentials, no press release, just function, just flight. Maya called Clara one evening, her voice low but bright. I just got off a call with Aeroscope Labs, she said. They're integrating his logic into their atmospheric launch test. And get this, one of their advisors saw the whiteboard photo you posted. He recognized the handwriting. Clara blinked, recognized it. It matched an old R&D log from 1983. Apparently, Huy Linh's code was once part of a military stabilization prototype. The file got lost in a digitization overhaul. Buried, forgotten, and now Clara asked. Now Maya said they want him to come back. Not for a review, for recognition. Clara visited Huy that weekend. He was in the same chair on the same balcony, sipping the same cinnamon tea. She told him everything what she posted, how it spread, the emails, the acknowledgements. He didn't react, not at first. Then he looked out at the sky and said, "Wind remembers the ones who listen." She smiled. "They're calling it the Lin pause." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" She nodded. "Does it matter to you?" He thought for a moment, then replied, "Only if they stop calling it luck." That night, back in her apartment, Clara opened the original napkin one last time. She placed it gently inside a plastic sleeve, sealed it shut, and slipped it into a box labeled "Things That Changed Everything." Because sometimes the quietest voices don't echo. They resonate forever. The event was never meant to be a ceremony. It was just supposed to be a demo. A simple public launch of Aeroscope's new atmospheric drone platform, held in a converted hangar at the edge of the Mojave Desert. Engineers, investors, students, a few journalists, maybe 24 in total. Clara stood in the back row. She didn't expect anything more than a flight test and some corporate jargon, until she saw him standing quietly near the wing of the prototype drone, adjusting the nose trim with a small wrench. Old windbreaker, same thermos, same silence. Huy Linh had returned. Not for fame, not for headlines. He had simply been invited to tune the final sequence before launch, because they trusted his hands more than their software. Maya stepped up to the microphone. She didn't clear her throat, didn't rehearse. She just spoke. "We've spent a lot of years trying to perfect what flight looks like from the outside. Today we're here because someone showed us how to listen to what flight feels like on the inside." She gestured toward the drone behind her. "This machine shouldn't be able to hover clean in crosswinds. But it does. Because of one man's logic. One man's pause." She turned to where Huy stood and said his name clearly. "Mr. Huy Linh." He blinked. Everyone turned to look. He hadn't expected that. Clara saw him hesitate just a little. A flicker of doubt. Then the applause started, soft at first, then building, and then rising like something long overdue, finally breathing. He walked forward slowly. No smile, no wave, just presence. They handed him a badge. He didn't look at it. He looked at the drone and said quietly, "Ready when you are." Clara activated the startup sequence herself. The drone's engine spun to life, but not too fast. The pause was built in now. The system waited not for a command, but for permission from the wind. It lifted, perfectly, held steady in a corridor of shifting desert air. A hush fell across the crowd. Not from awe, but from agreement. Everyone there had seen launches before, but never like this. Never so still, never so sure. After landing, one of the executives from the review board approached Huy. Same cold eyes, but something in them had shifted. He extended a hand. "I didn't understand your line the first time I saw it," the man admitted. "Now I'm wondering how many others I've erased too soon." Huy didn't shake his hand. He just nodded, then turned to Clara. "They still think I wrote it to impress them," he said quietly. She smiled. "No. Now they know. You wrote it because the sky didn't need noise. It needed listening." Back inside the hangar, someone had rewritten the whiteboard. Not just the code, but a title above it. "The Lin pause. Flight begins with listening." And beneath it, engineers had begun leaving initials. Not for credit, but for gratitude. Clara added hers last, then stepped back and saluted gently like folding a memory. Huy stood beside her. No words, just eyes a little brighter, and somewhere above them in the quiet sky that had never forgotten him. The wind agreed. The hangar had emptied, but he stayed, long after the crowd had gone and the drone had been wheeled back inside. After the lights dimmed and the applause became memory, Huy Linh stood alone by the launch pad, one hand resting on the cool metal wing. Clara watched him from a distance. He wasn't posing, wasn't reflecting. He was listening to the stillness, to the breath of air that moved across the desert floor. Then from the far edge of the tarmac, a voice called out, "Sir, permission to approach." Huy turned. It was a man in full flight uniform, gray hair, strong frame, eyes like stone weathered by time. He walked slowly, purposefully, stopped a few feet away, then stood tall heels together back straight, and saluted. Crisp, sharp, absolute. Not the kind of salute given to rank, but to legacy. To someone who made the sky a little safer and never asked to be thanked. Huy nodded just once. His eyes didn't water, but something inside them softened. The man lowered his hand. "My father flew recon in '81, he said quietly. He said there was a line of code back then that saved him in a dust storm off the coast. No one knew where it came from. Now he did. And with that, he turned and walked away." Huy looked back at the drone. It hadn't moved, but somehow, it was still flying. Back home, his apartment hadn't changed. Same chipped teacup on the windowsill. Same folded shirts in the second drawer. Same little wooden box where he kept the napkin Clara once returned. Huy Linh didn't frame awards. He didn't update resumes, but on a small, outdated laptop sitting on the corner of his desk, he opened a text file, one he'd named years ago in silence. Light notes. Still holding. And he typed, "If wind, diff." Arrow 3. Wait for stability. 42 years later, still true. He saved it. Closed the lid. Outside, the sun was setting behind the rooftops, casting golden light across the quiet streets. A soft breeze moved through the open window, stirring a curtain just slightly. Almost like the air was saying thank you. Weeks later, a new firmware update rolled out across dozens of startup protocols for next-gen drones. Engineers from 5 countries signed off on the change. But tucked into the version, notes was one quiet line. Startup stabilization logic adapted from the Lin pause, origin unknown, legacy undeniable. Clara visited once more that month. She didn't bring questions. She just sat beside him watching the sky, and in the silence between them, filled only by wind, she whispered, "You didn't just write code. You taught machines to wait, like you always did." Huy smiled, sipped his tea, and said, without needing to be heard, still holding,